The liberty of the child should have its limits, the collective interest as its forms. I even put still processing here. And that's something I wanted to ask y'all, like, what do you think she's referring to in that first paragraph, specifically where it ends, the teacher must understand and feel her position of observer. The activity must lie in the phenomenon. And I can also share my screen in case you don't have your book right in front of you, or it may be look a little different here. Please do not mind my notes on my screen, but it's this paragraph here.
Britt, this reminds me of Dr. Montessori's concept of will, where, you know, we want to balance again, as she says here, the liberty of the child, the freedom, but we also want to strengthen the child's will, and the limits to the child's use of their will is the respect for the environment around them. And I love, I'm not sure where she says it, Andy, you know where she says her job is not to break, but to strengthen their will. And I think this is related to that. They're free so long as they consider the social environment in which we want them to live with purpose. And back to your point with courtesy and if we can call it politeness. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes me think about some other notes I have as you were talking. Okay, yes, it does, because it makes me think about when oftentimes people will interpret the Montessori method as total freedom. And I've seen this play out, and where people will say, well, let them just be free. But then that freedom then turns into, honestly, chaos that happens in the environment. And it's this idea of like, we're following the children right off the edge, right off the cliff.
What struck me about this conversation just now between Regina and Britt is how it ties back to what Adrian was saying about how life just happens, right? Whether or not we interfere with it, life is going to happen. So for me, that's where our role as the observer comes in. And that line that you have highlighted and read there, we have to feel that position. We have to embody that position. We have to become the observer so that we can see what happens when life does happen. And as far as the activity lying in the phenomenon, it's like, that is giving the child the power to be the active agent. Mm. And that can only happen when we're not.
And again, that brings us to the whole concept of teaching versus guiding. At our school, we're not all, the staff is Montessori trained. These are people who are dedicated and want to do the best job they can. And when I say it's okay, sit down and just observe. And then we need to tell them what to observe, but they feel they're not doing their job if they're not actually teaching. I think that's a huge shift for Montessori guides, that we need not be the active ones. We must encourage activity in the children. The other part is how do we convey that to parents, right? When they ask their child, what did you do today? Nothing. And then they wonder, what was the teacher doing all day? The child was doing nothing. So it's part of that bigger picture that we need to make sure we communicate to people outside our environments. Again, so that the children can be free to do what they need to be doing and not feel pressure from either the teacher or the parent or whatever.
How what you said is so counterintuitive to many of us that live in such a consumerist and productive driven society, where if I'm sitting and observing, I remember the training they say just sit on your hands, right? When your classroom becomes normalized, sit on your hands, like you have done your work and they are doing their work. And I just remember feeling not good enough then. Like if I'm not able to check things off of a checklist, if I'm not able to come home and report to my husband and say, here, all the things I've done today, then I feel like I have not done my work. And it goes back to, and this is something else, this was actually, so after I read it, I write down these questions that I'm left with and some next steps. And one of mine was, but I must also then understand child development and also trauma to fully grasp what freedom and discipline mean, and then what else do I need to do? And so it makes me think about, if I can fully grasp, for instance, child development, then I would be able to articulate to my families, this is where the child is, and this is what they're working on as they're developing in their children. It's much more about their own development, and it's going to be less about, well, here are the presentations that I presented to your child, and here's this work plan, and how many, even, when we'll say, how many works did you get done today? That goes back to being very product driven. And so many of these things that we see seep into our teaching practice. I can remember, my first year teaching, and some of the teachers were saying, I said, how do you get the children to work? How do you get them to work? And I remember teachers saying, oh, well, in my classroom, I require them to do 4 works a day. And I remember trying that for a little bit. And I remember failing miserably, because what I learned is the children are far more smarter than me. And they will figure it out to get to what they really want to do and where they really need to be. And so, but it's just interesting how all of these things, if you don't fully grasp how they can seep in.